Chris Harman, How Marxism Works. Section: Capitalism, How the System Began. One of the most ludicrous arguments you hear is that things could not be different to the way they are now. Yet things were different, and not on some distant part of the globe, but in this country not so long ago. A mere 250 years ago, people would have regarded you as a lunatic if you had described to them the world we live in now, with its huge cities, its great factories, its aeroplanes, its space expeditions. Even its railway systems were beyond the bounds of their imagination. For they lived in a society which was overwhelmingly rural, in which most people had never traveled 10 miles outside their local village, in which the pattern of life was determined, as it had been for thousands of years, by the alternation of the seasons. But already, 700 or 800 years ago, a development had begun, which was to challenge this whole system of society. Groups of craftsmen and traders began to establish themselves in towns, not giving their services for nothing to some lord, as the rest of the population did, but exchanging products with various lords and serfs for foodstuffs. Increasingly, they used precious metals as a measure of that exchange. It was not a big step to seeing in every act of exchange an opportunity to get a little extra of the precious metal to make a profit. At first, the towns could only survive by playing one lord against another. But as the skills of their craftsmen improved, they created more wealth, and they grew in influence. The burghers, the bourgeois, or the middle classes, began as a class within the feudal society of the Middle Ages, but they obtained their riches in a quite different way to the feudal lords who dominated that society. A feudal lord lived directly off the agricultural produce he was able to force his serfs to produce on his land. He used his personal power to make them do this, without having to pay them. By contrast, the wealthier classes in the towns lived off the proceeds of selling non-agricultural goods. They paid workers wages to produce these for them, by the day or week. These workers, often escaped serfs, were, quote, free to come and go as they liked, once they had finished the work for which they had been paid. The only compulsion on them was that they would starve if they did not find employment with someone. The rich could only go richer because rather than starve, the, quote, free worker would accept less money for his work than the goods he produced were worth. We will return to this point later. For the present, what matters is that the middle-class burghers and the feudal lords got their wealth from quite different sources. This led them to want society organized in different ways. The feudal lord's ideal was a society in which he had absolute power in his own lands, unbound by written laws, with no intrusion from any outside body, with his serfs unable to flee. He wanted things to stay as in the days of his father and grandfather, with everyone accepting the social station into which they were born. The newly rich bourgeoisie necessarily saw things differently. They wanted restraints on the power of individual lords or kings to interfere with their trade or steal their wealth. They dreamed of achieving this through a fixed body of written laws, to be drawn up and enforced by their own chosen representatives. They wanted to free the poorer classes from serfdom, so that they could work, and increase the burghers' profits, in the towns. As for themselves, their fathers and grandfathers had often been under the thumb of feudal lords, and they certainly did not want that to continue. In a word, they wanted to revolutionize society. Their clashes with the old order were not only economic, but also ideological and political. Ideological chiefly meant religious in an illiterate society, where the chief source of general ideas about society was church preaching. Since the medieval church was run by bishops and abbots, who were feudal lords in their own right, it propagated pro-feudal views, attacking as sinful many of the practices of the urban bourgeoisie. So in Germany, Holland, Britain, and France, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the middle classes rallied to a religion of their own, Protestantism, a religious ideology that preached thrift, sobriety, hard work, especially for the workers, and the independence of the middle class congregation from the power of bishops and abbots. The middle class created a god in their image, in opposition to the god of the Middle Ages. Today we are told at school or on television about the great religious wars and civil wars of that period, as if they were just about religious differences, as if people were daft enough to fight and die merely because they disagreed over the role of the blood and the body of Christ in the Holy Communion. But much more was at stake. The clash between two completely different forms of society, based upon two different ways of organizing the production of wealth. In Britain, the bourgeoisie won. Horrific as it must seem to our present ruling class, their ancestors consecrated their power by cutting off a king's head, justifying the act within the rantings of Old Testament prophets. But elsewhere, the first round went to feudalism. In France and Germany, the Protestant bourgeois revolutionaries were wiped out after bitter civil wars, although a feudal version of Protestantism survived as the religion of northern Germany. The bourgeoisie had to wait 2 centuries and more before enjoying success in the second round that began without religious clothing in 1789, Paris. End of section.